Here. Okay, so this is a puzzle where you can rearrange the white pieces anywhere to create a checkmate. So first of all, I'm going to put the king up here, and the king's on the strongest attacking square relative to the black king. It denies the king of these three squares, and then I'm going to put the rook down on the back. That'll be checkmate. Okay, so go to the next position. Okay, so I'm going to put a rook on the 7th rank, stopping the king moving up, and I'll put the rook on the back line, and that'll be checkmate. So it's a fairly important mate with two rooks against the king. Now I've got a queen and a pawn, so the queen can checkmate if it's on a square in front of the king. If the defending king's on the edge of the board, if the queen's in front and the queen's guarded by absolutely anything, so in this case the pawn, that will be checkmate. Okay, so this time the queen checkmates with a knight to help. So same sort of thing. Put the queen in front of the king, put the knight somewhere where it defends the queen, and that will be a checkmate. This time it's the queen and bishop. To make it a bit more interesting, I'll checkmate with the bishop. So I'll put the queen here. So the queen's denied the king of every square except for here. So if we put the bishop on this diagonal, that will be a checkmate with the bishop and the queen. Okay, so this time a queen and rook. I mean, I could just do the same pattern as with two rooks. To make it more interesting, I'll do something different. I'll put the queen here. And if I have the rook guarding the queen, it's mate because the rook also guards the square. Another kind of mating pattern with these two pieces is to put the rook there, have the queen defending it like that. So the rook could have moved down, give a mate. This time rook and knight, it's basically only one checkmate. The knight has to be on this square here, controlling the two squares next to the king. If the rook's either there or there, that would be mate. So say if the rook was here, you can move the rook down and make mate. So that's a pretty fancy mate with a rook and knight. Okay, this time we can create a checkmate with the pawns checking. So I'll put one pawn here to give check, put another pawn here to defend the pawn, and put the knight here to guard these two squares, and that's a checkmate. So the pawn has just moved forward, mate. Okay, so this time we checkmate with the king and two knights. This particular endgame, you cannot force this mate, but you can set up a mate. So I'll put a king on this square, denying the black king from these two squares. I'll put one knight where it's checking the king, and the other knight to guard the king's possible escape. So to checkmate, we need to control these four squares, so the king is mated. This time we're going to mate with two knights and a pawn. So I don't think it cannot be done with a knight checking. So I'll check with the pawn. I'll defend that with something, and the other knight will guard these two squares. So the pawn's just moved down. Should create a checkmate. Now I've got a bishop, knight and pawn, so how are we going to do this? So I'll say the bishop's checking, I'll have the pawn guard one escape square, and the knight guard another. So that's one way you can make checkmate with those pieces. So yeah, I don't think you can do it with a knight checking, and yes, you could do it with the pawn checking, because you could have a pawn here, the knight here, and you could have the bishop guarding the pawn somehow. So the pawn could have moved up, checkmate. Now, two knights and a bishop. So, a few different ways of doing it, I think. Let's see. Put the bishop here, put a knight here, guarding these squares. All I have to do is guard the bishop with the other knight. Okay, next one. Two pawns and a bishop. So, put one pawn here, one pawn here, and we'll just put the bishop somewhere on this diagonal. There would have been illegal unless white's last move was discovered check. So that is a checkmate. This white pawn here could have also been over here. Now checkmate with a king and 2 bishops. I'll put the king on the strongest square. I'll put the bishop somewhere where it guards the escape. Where it guards the escape square, and the other bishop will move to checkmate. So there's a checkmate. 2 bishops and a knight. Okay, so I'll put a bishop on this diagonal. I'll guard one of the white squares with the knight, and the bishop guards the other one. So we have a checkmate. King, knight and pawn. Okay, I'll add a king over here, say. Put the pawn on the 7th rank. The black king's in stalemate. All I need to do is have the knight check the king, and that will make it mate. 2 bishops and a pawn. Okay. 2 bishops and a pawn. Well, if the bishop and 2 pawns could do it, this can. So I'll put 1 bishop there, a pawn there. I'll move this up somewhere. And there's a checkmate with 2 bishops and a pawn. Now rook, knight and bishop. Okay, so what I could do is I could add a knight here to guard these 2 squares. I could put the rook on the 7th rank. And I can check with the bishop, and that will make mate. 2 knights and a rook. So I can check on the back line and use the knights to stop the king moving off the back line. So that's one mate. Another mate is to have the rook on the 7th rank. This time check with the knight and have the other knight guard the escape squares. Okay, rook, knight and bishop. So yeah, so there's lots of ways we could do this. I could check with the rook, have the knight cover some escape squares, have the bishop cover the other escape square. Rook and 2 pawns. So what we want to do is put the pawns next to each other so they control all the squares in front of the king, and we'll put the rook on the back rank and give checkmate. Rook, knight and pawn. Put a pawn right in front of the king. I have the rook defend the pawn, and we need to check the king and control the square, so I'll put the knight here, mate. This one. Okay, again I'll put the pawn in front of the king. I'll put the rook so it defends the pawn, and this bishop can move somewhere on this diagonal and give mate. King, bishop and pawn. I'll put the pawn there, say, have the king defend the pawn, and the bishop can go in mate. Rook, knight and king. We can do it with just a king and rook. So what I'll do is I'll do a pattern you can't do with just the king and the rook. I'll have the pawn guard the rook, and all I have to do is guard this pawn of the king. The king could also be here, and that makes it checkmate. Okay, king and 2 knights. Oddly enough, you can do this, even though you cannot force checkmate with king and 2 knights against king. You can actually set up a mate with the king on the side. If I put the king here, I put the knight in check. All I have to do is cover these 2 squares. So notice how the 2 knights control a whole square of squares. That is a checkmate. Okay, king, bishop and knight. Okay, I'll put the king on the strongest square. Add a bishop, and check with the knight somewhere. That will make a checkmate. King, knight and rook. I'll put the knight here, put the king here, and I'll put the rook here. So what I'm aiming to do is do the fanciest checkmate with the 3 pieces. For example, I could mate with just the king and rook in this position, but here I can create a fancy one with the rook, knight and king. Okay, so we can do this is a checkmate here. I have 1 bishop checking the king. I have another bishop controlling squares next to the king. So all I have to do is use my king to control those 2 squares. So put it there or there. That is checkmate. King, pawn and bishop. So okie dokie. So I'll have the bishop check. Put the pawn here. Put the king here, say. Make a checkmate. King and 2 pawns. Put 1 pawn in front of the king. Put the king behind that pawn. Put the pawn here. This pawn's going to advance. Make checkmate. king, knight and pawn. Okay, so what I'm going to do is put the pawn in front of the king, put the king where it defends the pawn. The black king is now stalemated. All I have to do is check with the knight on any of these squares. That'll be mate. Okay, so now it's an easy one. I just need the pawn here or here to guard the escape square, and I'll put the rook on the back line. Mate. Two bishops. All I have to do is check the king and guard the escape square. That'll be a mate. All I have to do is check the king and use a knight here, maybe over here. That will be mate. Oh, that's interesting. I use the king to trap the king, and the pawn goes forward, mate. Rook and bishop. Okay, so one way I could do it is the rook can cover the escape, and the bishop checks, and that's mate. The rook could check on the back rank, the bishop covering the escape, that could be a mate. Or I could have the rook right next to the king, with the bishop covering it, and that is also mate. Two rooks, so lots of ways can be done. Probably the fanciest one is to put a rook there and the other rook behind it to defend it. Your knights. Use one knight to stop the king from moving. The other knight can be here or maybe here, and that will be mate. Queen and knight. I'll put the queen to stop the king from moving, and the knight can go here or here, mate. Put the bishop on the diagonal, and the rook goes here, and that's a mate. Have the queen stopping the king from moving, the rook can check on the back rank, mate. Have a pawn stopping the king from moving off the back line and give a back rank mate. Have a knight covering the escape squares and put the rook on the back rank mate. Have the queen stopping the king from moving. If I add a knight, knight can be there or there, it will be mate. I have the queen stopping the king from moving. I'll check with the bishop, and that will be mate. I'll put the king here, move the rook to the back line. That will be mate. Oh, that's interesting. The black pawn's about the queen, so I'll put the king here to stop the king from moving. Now I'll check with the knight there or there, and that will be mate. Do the same thing with the king and the bishop. That is mate. Okay, so now the king's in the centre. So how do we mate? We put one king here, stop it moving to the fourth rank. I'll check with the rook. Now I'll use the queen to stop it moving along there, and that's a mate. Okay, so mate with queen and two pawns. So I'll check like how are we going to do this? Queen and two pawns is going to be done. Yes, one pawn, put the queen here, I have one pawn here, and I have one pawn here, and that is a mate of queen and two pawns in the centre of the board. Okay, next, queen, knight and pawn. Okay, so all I have to do is check one square away from the king, use the pawn to defend it. Now all I need is the knight to guard these two squares. I can put the knight down there, that makes checkmate. Okay, now I can do a similar thing. I can check with the queen. I can defend the queen. Put the bishop controlling these two squares to make a mate. Now, the fancy one. Rook and two bishops against king. Okay, bishop defends the rook by x-ray. The king cannot go to these squares because of the rook. These squares because of the bishop, so that is mate. Queen, two bishops. Okay, so one way to do it is I could check on the diagonal, defended by one bishop, and use the other bishop to defend this diagonal, so that's mate. Okay, queen and... Okay, so I could have the queen here, say. I could have a rook here, and I could have the bishop defend the remaining square. So there's a lot of possibilities for that one. Queen, king, knight and king. So I could put the king there, the queen there, defend the queen with the knight, so that's a mate. Going to have a pawn here, queen defended by a pawn. All I have to do is control these two squares, so I put the king on e7, controlling those two squares, so that's mate. And similar sort of thing. I can put the king in the centre, defended by the queen in the centre, defended by the king, and use the bishop to stop the king from swinging out, so that's a mate. I could check with a rook, use the other rook to stop the king moving to the fourth rank and stop the king moving backwards, so that's a mate. I can check with the queen, guarded by a pawn, and use the rook to stop the king getting away. I could check with a queen, guarded by a knight, and stop the king from getting into these two squares, so that's a mate. I could check with queen, guarded by the knight, use a bishop to stop the king from escaping. I could, I think we had this one. I could put a rook there, queen there, and the bishop to guard the square, so that's a mate. Okay, so this is an easy one. I can just put all the pieces on ranks. That makes a mate. Okay, if I put the bishop on this diagonal, all I have to do is put the knight here, or here, and that is mate. And ditto, I can put the bishop here, all I have to do is check with the rook. That's mate. So the mate with a lone knight. Don't you love it? We're going to use the rook to control the file, and we'll check with the knight. That makes mate. And ditto. Oh, and yeah, that's the end of the section. Thank you for watching.